Hello again, everybody. My name is Don Green, Technical Advisor for Business Skills at City and Guilds, looking after Customer Service Practitioner and Specialist. I hope you're enjoying your standardisation event today. I've just put this short slide deck together with audio just to go through some good practice and some recommendations. Sorry I can't be with you in person. Fingers crossed that will happen sometime soon. As per usual, if you've got any questions, feel free to email me, dominic.green@cityandguilds.com. So briefly then, we're just going to look at Customer Service Practitioner, which is the level 2 first, followed by the Specialist. Similar format throughout. Going to look at the initial results from this year, good practice, some recommendations from the IEPA, and then a bit of a general overview. So let's first look at Customer Service Practitioner, which is the level 2 endpoint assessment. So 2020-2021 was a strange year. Obviously the observations didn't really happen a great deal due to COVID-19. Obviously that was replaced with a witness testimony as dispensation, which was introduced via IFATE. We are expecting the dispensation of the witness testimony to finish in end of December 2021, so the end of this year. That's not been finalised yet, but it gives you a rough idea of what to work to with regard to using that witness testimony from employers. So the components of the practitioner level 2, which you know about, is the showcase portfolio with interview, the observation or witness testimony, and the PD itself. We saw some fantastic results in 2021 with 22% getting a pass and 64% actually getting a distinction. So some really positive figures there. So let's first look at the showcase portfolio with the attached interview. There are two methods here to present the portfolio. One is in a report format, 3,500 words. The other is a PowerPoint or a slide deck with audio transcript over the top. We're seeing that the majority of cases that the report is being used. There's plenty of structure available within the endpoint assessment pack for the apprentices, and so that's proving really popular. We are still seeing occasionally the old style portfolios being submitted, and there is a clear difference in quality here between those and the relatively new format of the report or the slide deck. Clearly the report is providing the most distinctions, so we'd certainly recommend that if it's appropriate for the learner. The old style portfolios are being phased out or have been phased out, but occasionally we do still receive some. The associated paperwork with that has actually disappeared off the website, so we strongly recommend following the report or the slide deck. The interview that's around that showcase portfolio then is being seen to allow the learner to add further depth to the portfolio. They can really dig deep into their pieces of evidence and explain them in detail, and that interview is also allowing the IEPAs to probe further, to allow the apprentices to stretch themselves somewhat to get to that distinction criteria. And quite often they don't actually realise that they're doing it within that interview, and it is resulting in some really top-notch grades. So essentially that interview addressing any issues and perhaps upskilling them to make sure that they get a pass, in the same time upskilling them as well if they're a strong pass to try and get them to achieve that distinction criteria. What we're seeing is a variety of pieces of evidence used, which is fantastic. So lots of witness testimonies, observations, professional discussions, reflective accounts, and of course the work product evidence. So a real variety there that's been used is making those portfolios rich in quality. Of course, you can't pass the customer service practitioner without a PDP, and we are seeing lots of solid working documents in the form of PDPs, which is allowing the learner to show their progression, show their targets, smart targets, etc. throughout their own program, and it's following them through their chosen career in customer service, and they're proving to be extremely worthwhile in mapping across the KSPs and achieving those distinction criteria. Learners are also evidencing really well how they not only meet the requirements of their role, but how they're exceeding the requirements of the role. So they're going above and beyond at level 2, and often that's making sure that's allowing the learner to achieve those distinction criteria. Essentially, what they're doing is putting the customer at the front of everything that they do. So showing that the customer is the focus of everything that they're about and everything that they do, which is really providing some quality evidence there. Of course, with the good comes the bad, or not so good rather, and so the IEPAs have recommended or tried to stress that we don't always see perfect portfolios, and often that comes from the likes of IEPAs not being able to locate evidence, so making sure that the portfolios are referenced properly, that the IEPA knows what the evidence is trying to achieve. Sometimes we are seeing that the evidence reference form is not submitted along with the portfolio, which in this case makes the EPA coordinators actually return the showcase portfolio for that to be completed before the endpoint assessment, which again is just putting an extra pressure on the time constraints and on the apprentice as well to turn it around before the endpoint assessment happens. Generally, we'd like to see headers on each page, and of course the evidence that's been submitted is again mapped across to the specific criteria it's trying to achieve. If the showcase portfolio is of poor quality, it doesn't necessarily mean that the showcase will fail. It just means that that interview is then proving rather difficult for the learner to achieve the pass criteria. So the stronger the showcase submission is, the easier it is for the IEPA to confirm competency and then allow the 30 minutes given to actually probe deeper to try and get the learner to be upskilled to that distinction criteria. Where witness testimonies or employer references are being used, it must be personal to the apprentice, not the team did this or the department did that. So making sure that the witness testimony really focuses on the learner themselves. And of course, when witness testimonies are used, making sure that it's specific work-based examples that are being discussed, not generic pieces of evidence or generic tasks at all. So being very clear with those witness testimonies what they're about and what it is that they're trying to achieve with relation to the KSBs. We are still seeing now and again the task manuals or the apprenticeship task manuals being submitted, otherwise known as workbooks, which is absolutely fine, but please note that if this is the case, then often they don't necessarily dig deep enough to generate the quality evidence that we require. Quite often the best evidence comes from work-placed evidence rather than the task manuals. They're great for underpinning knowledge, they're great to teach and to learn from, but as forms of evidence they are okay, but you're less likely to get learners to achieve the distinction criteria if they're just completed. Occasionally we do see some poorly represented areas within the portfolios, and if that's the case, then we do tend to see some trends. The trends then generally is that the understanding of the organisation is a specifically weak area, specifically 3.4, 3.5, so describe the type of guidelines in a digital media policy that affect the use of social and digital media in the work environment. Products and service knowledge, especially 1.1, 1.2, so explaining the difference between the features and benefits of products and services in relation to the organisation, where the apprentices often refer to the meaning of features and benefits and not the actual features and benefits of the organisation's products and services, so something to be aware of there. Personal organisation, specifically 1.1, 1.2, prioritise and plan the completion of tasks according to agreed deadlines, as many apprentices here refer to the PDP for tasks and deadlines rather than their actual day-to-day activities, so again something to be aware of. Dealing with customer conflict and challenge, so here 4.2, maintain accurate record of customer issues and progress to resolution, needs to be specifically focused on. And then developing self, both 1.1, 1.2, so conduct and self-assessment to identify the apprentice's strengths and weaknesses in relation to the job role, and 2.1, 2.2, produce a personal development plan to support the achievement of the agreed learning and development goals. That must be in there. And of course we are aware that there must be a PDP present in that showcase portfolio. If there's no PDP there, then the developing self part of the component essentially can't be achieved. And you can't bring new evidence to that interview, so we are relying on what's in the portfolio to then be developed within the interview. So making sure then that a personal development plan is submitted as part of that developing self module. So as I mentioned previously then, the observations haven't really taken place this last year for obvious reasons. IFATE introduced the employer witness testimony as dispensation for the observation, which has proved really successful actually. We've got to remember that employers are not necessarily used to writing witness testimonies. It's not part of their day-to-day job. And with that in mind, we have generally received some really quality pieces of examples. Of course, not every piece of evidence is quality. So now and again, we do get the often weaker one, which tends to be generic rather than specific examples. But obviously there are two formats to submit. So that's a written witness testimony or an audio witness testimony, which is recorded. Generally, employers are using the written format, and they are successfully mapping that holistically to the KSBs. Hopefully that's with the support of yourselves, as obviously it's not part of their normal routine to write such a thing. We're also seeing that apprentices are really well prepared for their endpoint assessment in relation to the Q&A surrounding that witness testimony. So they've listened or they've read the witness testimony many times prior to, they've tried to predict the Q&A around that witness testimony. They've really researched and studied it hard prior to going into that Q&A, which is paying dividends. And we're seeing that throughout the Q&A, and where we have done observations as well, is that the apprentices are showing a high level of professionalism, which is fantastic. So with regard to what could be improved with the employer witness testimonies, as we said, there's very little observations that have happened. Occasionally we are getting employer witness testimonies that lack specific work-based examples. They tend to be generic statements or generic tasks that they're discussing rather than specific examples, which is really doing a bit of an unjust service to the apprentice, because they clearly can do it, but the employers are not going into sufficient detail about how they do it, the benefits of what they've done, and how quality it was. So it's really about supporting the employer to write those witness testimonies. Obviously you can't do it for them, but you can certainly check them and support them to make sure that they are providing quality evidence that's holistically mapped across. So where we're seeing weaker ones, they tend to be around not adapting to different customers and needs, upholds the core values and service culture of the organisation, not providing evidence around willingness to work with others and share ideas, remaining positive professional when circumstances are challenging, which obviously we've seen a lot of recently, and to take ownership from beginning to end. So that's where the employers are struggling within the employer witness testimony. So take note of those particular areas and cross-check to make sure that they've covered those specific areas. So because we haven't been carrying out face-to-face observations, obviously endpoint assessments have also are also being done remotely. So virtually all the PDs have been carried out remotely using GoToMeeting, the remote platform that we use. They have essentially been really positive in explaining the importance of building the good customer relationships. So the PDs allowed that to seen quality evidence within that around the building of good customer relationships and the needs of the customers. We've seen learners discuss appropriate work-based examples from their own personal work role, which is good. And it's clear that those who have practiced the PDs with the training providers prior to endpoint assessment did significantly better. So there's certainly value in practicing carrying out mock PDs, etc., and mock showcase interviews as well, to get the learner used to what's going to happen on the day in the endpoint assessment. Of course, when we go back to face-to-face, the professional discussion will be done at the same time on the day in a room that on the same day that the observation happens. So when we do go back to that, it's about making sure that you're going to be able to find a room for the apprentice and IUPA to go into without being disturbed. So the IUPAs then have found that where the PDs have not been brilliant, it's clear that the apprentices haven't carried out mock PDs. So making sure then that a bit of time is spent to practice for their endpoint assessment by doing the PDs, interviews, etc. The learner also needs to make sure that they understand the criteria that needs to be covered within the PD. The PD's got its own KSBs. The learner should be on the ball, knowing full well what those KSBs are, to make sure that they can cover them in depth with quality answers. So specifically then, learners, if they are struggling, these are the key areas. So the difference between an internal and external customer, which is quite surprising actually, because that should be pretty basic stuff. Describing the specific needs of different customers, including those protected under current equality law, and how the organisation adapts its approach to the needs of the customers. So really drill down in those mock PDs around those specific areas to make sure that the learner can provide that quality evidence. So it's not rocket science then, after what I've just said, to basically summarise then that learners should be practising their portfolio-based interviews, timing them, making sure they're lasting that half hour, the Q&As and those PDs, so carrying out those mocks. And of course, the learner is on their own on the day during endpoint assessment where it's remote. And so where it is remote, making sure that the learner is aware of IT issues and can they manage those IT issues on the day? Can they log on? Do they know where to log on, etc.? Do they know what time? Are they in the correct room? Are they not going to get disturbed, etc.? Have they got their identification with them to show the endpoint assessor through the camera, etc.? And making sure then that the apprentices have the ability to draw on examples taken from their own working practice, which again is pretty much common sense. Okay, brief look now at the level 3 customer service specialist. So the assessment components for the level 3 specialist is the PD, which is based around that portfolio. The observation or witness testimony, obviously the testimony is superseding the observation at the moment, as with level 2. Again, we're thinking that the dispensation will continue till the end of December, but that's still to be finalised by IFATE. And then finally the work-based project, which is also supported by an interview. The project is of course done after Gateway and requires a project proposal to be signed off before that project can start. Now, the grading for this particular endpoint assessment is a little bit skewed. They're obviously not as good as the level 2, but then it hasn't been around as long as the level 2. We haven't had that many endpoint assessments completed at level 3. Many have been kind of postponed because of COVID. But generally at the time of these results being issued, we'd done less than 100, and we are finding that many learners are struggling with the project proposal, and that's proving the sticking area. So not quite as good, but 17% do achieve a pass, 34% do a distinction, and on first time we have had 49% that failed before conducting a resit. However, off the back of that, we've got to note that there's been less than 100 endpoint assessments, and as centres get used to the specific high-level challenge of that project, the numbers will rise significantly over the coming years. So similar to the level 2 practitioner, only the portfolio is graded on the PD. And so what we're seeing in the portfolio is areas such as reflective accounts, witness statements, feedback from customers, manager feedback. Obviously that PDP needs to be in there, that log, it must be in there in order to pass. Continuous professional development, reports on complaints or complex issues, how they were handled, were they referred, escalated, etc. Some presentations have been submitted, observations, service level agreements, limits of authority, and agreed PDPs. Agreed PDPs is the key there, so it's been signed by managers and it's a working document that's followed the learner through their ON programme. So the professional discussion then is graded off the back of the portfolio. Again, we're seeing similar things to some of the portfolios in level 2, so they're not always referenced properly. Sometimes the referencing form's not being submitted. These are often minor, not very frequent that this happens, but it's important to point it out. Slightly different in the way that the portfolio is submitted, so a minimum of 10 and a maximum of 15 pieces of evidence will be submitted rather than 3,500 words, which is level 2. We still require the header on each of the pieces of evidence, and of course that evidence must be mapped across to the criteria, the KSBs that it's trying to achieve. We must also make sure that where personal information has been inputted or used in the portfolio, that personal information is redacted. Occasionally we're still seeing customer information, private information being submitted, which obviously needs to be redacted prior to. Some have used scanned images or screenshots, and of course when they're pasted in, the quality of those images has deteriorated and the IEPA actually can't work out what numbers or figures are in there, and so it's proving difficult to mark, to assess. The portfolios themselves should refer to the criteria, just referring to the showcase criteria, so not the criteria throughout the whole assessment plan, but just the showcase criteria. We occasionally see portfolios mapped across to other assessment methods, and this is looking at the showcase portfolio only, so mapping the criteria across the showcase. And occasionally we're not seeing sufficient quality assurance of those portfolios, so it's clear that it's not been IQA'd prior to being submitted. Always good practice to IQA, which I know that you are good at actually, that you do have a rigorous IQA process in place, but occasionally we do see lack of quality assurance. Of course, everything that I'm talking about here today about what the IEPAs are seeing is referring to the whole of England and all the training providers and colleges throughout England, but it's just good practice to share what everyone else is doing so that you can take on board within Knowledge Pool. So the projects then is what the apprentices generally struggle on, if anything. We have seen some really good projects which have been complex in nature or simple in nature. It's not necessarily about how simple or how complex they are. It does need to be a high level challenge, but the actual project itself can be quite straightforward. What we're also seeing then is that the quality of research that's being undertaken is good, it's well considered. It's asked the right things for a specific reason. It's not just being done for the sake of the project. It's actually valuable and worthwhile to conduct such research. And of course, it has to be done in order for the project to be successful. We're also seeing it's obvious where the training provider has supported the apprentice with prior to the endpoint assessment. Because they've carried out those mock interviews, and it's clear that this has happened because the quality of the interviews that are happening are really good around the interview, around the project. So keep doing that, making sure that you're carrying out the mocks, not just with the project but with the PD as well around the portfolio. It really does make a difference to the learner for their endpoint assessment. And we are seeing that the learners are referring to their evidence provided in the portfolios, in the projects, which then allow them to expand during that interview and really delve down into the nitty-gritty, into the detail, and that's where the distinctions are coming from, where the learner is really aware of what they've written in their project report, and it's clear that they've clearly studied it beforehand. So the IEPAs, although they do see good practice, now and again they do see some weaker projects. That's obviously going to be the case. It's clear in the assessment plan that the project mustn't be started until it's signed off after Gateway. Now and again we get project proposals that are retrospective, so actually the project's already started or it's been completed and the learner's trying to manipulate it to use within endpoint assessment. And the assessment plan is very clear that if when the project is taking place, that it must be, it can't be retrospective, it must be actioned in endpoint assessment after gateway. Of course, that project has got to be complete within the 2 months, which is a task in itself, because communicating with stakeholders, etc., can be time consuming, carrying out research can be time consuming. What the IEPA is generally seeing is at the gateway stage that when that project proposal is submitted by the apprentice, is that the project proposal is not of a high level challenge, or not of a sufficient high level challenge. Often it's submitted just around a single complaint, and that is not at a higher level enough challenge or activity. So what is the project, when it's completed, what's it going to bring? How has it improved the customer service of that said business? What positives has come from it? Would you do anything different again? So it really must give the learner an opportunity to carry out something to make an impact on that organisation and the customer service associated to it. What's the customer actually getting from that project that the learner's carried out? And sometimes it's clear that the apprentices haven't really studied the project, the report that they've written prior to carrying out that interview. So again, banging that same drum, but about preparing the learner to do a mock interview prior to endpoint assessment. Now moving on to the employer witness testimony. Again, it's the same old story. The employers are not used to writing witness testimonies, therefore they're providing generic observations. It's not fulfilling the criteria, and it's not even meeting the pass criteria in some cases. And of course, that's then putting pressure on the learner to answer those questions or to give further evidence around that employer witness testimony. So making sure then that the witness testimony is IQA'd prior to it being submitted. Where we have seen excellent witness testimonies, the employers carefully read each of the KSBs. They've given 2 good examples against each, which obviously meet the required standard or quality. As far as OB2 is concerned, that criteria, knowing your customer and their needs, customer insight, there needs to be 3 examples. And the employers obviously are fully aware of this and then has provided some really nice examples within that witness testimony. And of course, off the back of what I've just said, the apprentice is aware of what the employers have written and therefore not struggling with the questioning around it. Of course, as with the level 2, we've not seen many observations take place, so this has been the priority as far as this assessment method is concerned. So the witness testimony is taken priority. Occasionally, we are seeing the basic detail within those witness testimonies, and although the employer is being positive around the apprentice, they've been quite generic. So that's kind of, again, not giving the full opportunity for the learner to gain a pass, never mind a distinction, and is putting extra pressure on them. So how can they be improved? How can they be amended? Reminding the employer that there's no word count, so they can be as long as you want. There's no restrictions there. Making sure that the employer is describing examples they've observed and not just giving the generic statements, such as Bill Sykes is really good at communicating with customers. He greets them really well. He's professional throughout. Too generic. It needs to be specific. And making sure that the learners don't have to rely on the Q&A. So if the evidence is already in that witness testimony, it allows the learner to expand on that within the Q&A, which is more likely to get them up to that distinction standard. And reminding the employer as well that if they don't particularly want to write the witness testimony, that they can record it in an audio format. So some employers might actually prefer to discuss what they've seen throughout the on-programme. So briefly then, similar to the level 2 practitioner, making sure that the learner practices the mocks, making sure the learner is fully aware of the IT issues, potential IT issues, the logins, the links, etc. on the day of the endpoint assessment, and making sure that they are fully prepared themselves for endpoint assessment by reading through the witness testimony, the project, the showcase, etc., and carrying out those mocks. So a whistle-stop tour for you there of the 2 customer service standards for you. Hopefully that will give you some food for thought and highlight some of the good and the weaker areas that can be worked upon. And fingers crossed, this time next year we can do this face-to-face, which will then give you the opportunity to ask questions and get an immediate response. Until then, enjoy your standardisation day and feel free to ask any questions via email. Thank you.